My name is Claire Maddox. I'm 31 years old, and the Tuesday my mother's group chat appeared on my phone was the day I finally understood that being useful to a family and being truly seen by one are two entirely different things, and that only one of them leaves a record. It started with a notification at 6:47 in the morning. My younger sister Dana had added me to a thread called House Final Steps. I don't think she meant to. There were 44 messages already waiting, sent across the previous 3 days while I had been covering a double shift at the hospital billing office where I work. The most recent one, sent at 11 the night before, was from my mother. It read, "Make sure Dennis has everything he needs and keep the closing date away from Claire. She'll want to talk it to death, and we're past that now." I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and read all 44 messages from the beginning. I did not reply right away. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove home. When I got there, I went to the glove compartment, took out the manila folder I had kept there since my grandfather died, and read the document inside from the first line to the last. Then I made coffee. What none of them knew, not my mother, not my brother Greg, not the realtor named Dennis Farrow who had apparently been walking through our grandfather's house for the past 3 weeks, was that the deed to that property did not belong solely to my parents to sell. It had not belonged to them alone since 2013. My grandfather, a man who said very little but watched everything, had made a quiet legal decision before his health declined, and he had done it without telling anyone except me and the notary who witnessed it. I want to explain how we got there because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. My grandfather, Edwin Maddox, built the house on Caraway Street himself in 1971. 2-story brick corner lot, the kind of house that took a decade of Saturdays to finish and another 4 decades to fill with the kind of history that makes a place feel like it belongs to everyone at once. He poured the foundation himself, with 2 men from his union local who owed him favors, on a Saturday in April when the ground was still cold in the mornings. He framed the upstairs rooms over the course of a summer, working evenings after his shift. He tiled the bathroom floor the year my mother was born, and it had not cracked once in all the years since. He raised my mother and her 2 sisters there. When my grandmother passed in 2004, he stayed. He said the walls still had her in them, and none of us argued with that. He was not a sentimental man by disposition, but he understood the weight of a place, which is a different thing from sentiment. Growing up, we spent every significant occasion at that house. Christmas Eve, Easter, the 4th of July, when the neighbors across the street would set off fireworks from their driveway and Grandpa would sit on the porch with his iced tea and pretend to disapprove. My brother Greg and I would sleep in the 2 upstairs bedrooms. Dana was young enough that she got the pull-out cot in the sewing room, which she considered a personal injustice until she was about 15. The house smelled like wood polish and the particular brand of laundry detergent my grandmother had used for decades, which Grandpa continued buying long after she was gone, for reasons he never explained and did not need to. My family is not cruel in the way people imagine when they hear stories like this one. They are not loud. They do not shout. What they do is allocate. My brother Greg is 4 years older than me, and from the time he was old enough to carry his own plate to the sink, he was the one my parents looked to first. Not because he asked for it. Not even because he was particularly well suited to it. It was simply the family's operating logic. Greg was the oldest, Greg was the son, and therefore Greg was consulted. I was the middle child who kept the records straight. I was the one who answered the insurance calls when my parents couldn't parse the explanation of benefit statements. I was the one who remembered the appointment dates, who filed the things that needed to be filed, who noticed when a bill had been charged twice and made the call to correct it. When my father had a minor cardiac event in 2016 and spent 3 days in the hospital, I was the one who sat with the attending physician, took notes on the discharge instructions, and followed up with the cardiologist's office about the medication adjustment. Greg flew in the day after my father was discharged. He stayed for the weekend and then flew back to Cincinnati. I was, in the language my mother once used without intending any harm by it, the one who handled the details. The details. I had been handling the details since I was 19 years old. I work as a hospital billing coordinator, which is a job that most people, when they hear it at a dinner party, acknowledge politely and then turn the conversation elsewhere. It requires a precise and patient understanding of insurance codes, claim adjudication processes, remittance reconciliation, and the particular kind of institutional logic that governs how money moves between healthcare providers and payers. I am good at my job. I have been promoted twice in 8 years. My supervisor, a woman named Renee Solberg, has said on 2 separate annual reviews that my error rate on complex claims is among the lowest in the department. I do not say this to establish credentials. I say it because the story of who I am inside my family is not the same as the story of who I am outside it, and for a long time I did not understand how much those 2 stories had diverged. When Grandpa's health began to shift, not a sudden collapse, but the slow, unglamorous retreat that comes with age and a heart that has been working hard for 81 years, it was me who drove him to appointments. Greg was in Cincinnati by then, building a career in commercial real estate that my parents spoke about with a particular reverence, the kind reserved for things they considered substantial. My mother would say, in her way, Greg is very busy with the business, and that would be the end of the conversation about why it was my Tuesday afternoons and not his. I did not resent driving Grandpa to his appointments.
I want to be clear about that.
I want to be very clear. Those drives were some of the best hours I have ever spent. He talked in the car the way he never talked at the dinner table, not in stories exactly, but in observations. He would watch a traffic light change and say something about patience that had nothing to do with the traffic light. He noticed things. He noticed that I noticed things too. He asked me once, on the way back from a follow-up with his cardiologist, what I actually did at work all day. I explained the billing coordination in some detail, the coding structure, the adjudication cycles, the particular logic of how insurance remittances get reconciled against billed charges, the way a claim can be denied for a reason that looks procedural but is actually a contractual dispute disguised as a data entry error. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual. Most people interrupt this explanation within 30 seconds because the specifics are not interesting to them. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead the way he always did. Not passively, but with attention, and then he said, "So you're the one who keeps the numbers honest." I said something like, "I try to." He nodded and looked out the passenger window, and that was the end of it, but I remembered it. I have thought about it many times since. It was the most accurate description of what I do that anyone has ever offered, and he arrived at it in about 60 seconds. He had a way of doing that, arriving at the accurate thing without a visible deliberation process. He watched, and then he saw, and then he said what he saw. He did it with people the same way he did it with structural problems. When he was building the house in 1971, a neighbor had told him his foundation placement was wrong and would cause drainage issues within a decade. Grandpa had looked at the land for a while, studied how the water moved when it rained, and then quietly moved the foundation stakes 3 feet east without argument or announcement. The house had not had a drainage problem in 50 years. He did not talk about this particular decision. He was not the kind of man who needed the record to show he had been right. He just needed the foundation to be in the right place. I think about that sometimes, the 3 feet east. The way a small, precise correction, made early and without fanfare, can determine everything that follows. In the spring of 2013, on a Thursday afternoon when I had taken a half-day from my billing job to drive him to a meeting with his estate attorney, a woman named Margaret Chu, whose office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown with a window that looked out over the river, he asked me to come inside instead of waiting in the car. I had waited in the car for every previous appointment. I had a habit of bringing something to read, and I had been doing exactly that. Parked on the street outside, 3 chapters into a library book, when he knocked on the passenger window and gestured for me to follow him. I followed him in. Margaret Chu's office was quiet and well-organized, the kind of space where the shelves hold binders that are actually used rather than decorative. She was in her mid-50s, precise and unhurried, with the manner of someone who has heard every variety of family complication and finds none of them surprising. She had a document already prepared on the conference table. 2 chairs had been pulled out. It was clear, in that way that rooms sometimes make clear, that both chairs were intended to be used. Grandpa sat down across from her, looked at me once, and said, "This is the one who shows up." Margaret Chu looked at me with an expression I can only describe as confirmation, as if something she had already assessed had now been verified in person. The document was a co-ownership amendment to the deed of the Caraway Street property. Grandpa was transferring a 49% ownership interest to me, while retaining 51% himself for the remainder of his life, after which his interest would pass through his estate in the standard way. His reasoning, which he explained to Margaret Chu in the same quiet voice he used for everything, was that he wanted someone who understood the value of a thing to have a legal stake in it. He did not want the house sold in a weekend by people who had not been the ones to maintain it.
He was not trying to create conflict, he said.
He simply wanted the paperwork to reflect what he believed was already true. Margaret Chu had the document notarized that afternoon. I signed where she indicated. Grandpa signed beside me. The notary, a young man named Paul Osei, who worked out of the same office, witnessed both signatures and applied his seal. Margaret Chu said she would file the amendment with the county recorder's office and that she would hold a copy on file and that I should keep a copy for myself. I drove Grandpa home. We stopped for ice cream because he wanted a cone and because it was 62 degrees outside, and he said that was close enough to summer. He had a single scoop of butter pecan in a sugar cone and ate it with the deliberate attention of a man who has learned not to take small pleasures casually. We did not talk about the deed on the drive home. He never mentioned it again after that afternoon. When I got home, I made a photocopy of the amendment. I slid it into a manila folder and put it in the glove compartment of my car. The original remained with Margaret Chu's office, filed with the county. I kept that folder in my glove compartment for 11 years. Not because I was waiting for a specific moment, not because I suspected anything. Simply because it was something that mattered, and the glove compartment was where I kept things that mattered and that I needed to be able to find. Grandpa passed in October of 2021. A Tuesday, appropriately enough, in the early morning hours, with a home care aide present and with the particular quietness that I have come to associate with deaths that have been given adequate time to arrive. He had been in home care for the last 4 months of his life, and I had been the one managing the care schedule, calling the agency, coordinating the aide's hours, making sure the medication list stayed current as his cardiologist made adjustments. I made a shared document with the aide's schedule and sent it to my parents, my mother's sisters, and Greg. Greg acknowledged it once. My mother used it. My father printed it and kept it on the kitchen counter at their house. My mother's sister Donna called it a lifesaver, which was the word she used, and she called me directly to say so. My parents were involved. I do not want to make them sound absent. My mother came to Grandpa's house every Sunday, without exception. She brought food, she sat with him, she kept her own counsel about what she was feeling in those visits. My father came when she came. Greg flew in twice, once for Grandpa's birthday in August, and once in the last week of October, which Greg seemed to sense would matter, and it did. I do not know how Greg knew. He was not the one tracking the medical details. But he arrived on a Thursday afternoon with a carry-on bag and a quiet that I had not seen in him before, and 3 days later Grandpa was gone, and Greg was there for it, and I was glad of that. The funeral was a Wednesday. The house on Caraway Street was full of people I had not seen in years. Cousins, neighbors, a man from Grandpa's old union who traveled 4 hours to be there and stood at the back of the room with his hands folded and did not say much to anyone. I handled the logistics because I was the one who knew where everything was kept. I had the name of the funeral home that Grandpa had specified in a document he'd given me 3 years earlier. I had the contact for the pastor. I had the list of people to call. I called them all. In the weeks after the funeral, my parents began talking about the house. I was not part of those conversations. I heard about them the way I heard about most family decisions. Indirectly through Dana, who would mention things in passing with the particular tone of someone who assumed I already knew. Mom and Greg are talking to a realtor, she said one evening in November 2021. They're thinking spring listing. I processed that information and held it. I did not call my mother about it. I did not bring it up at Thanksgiving. I told myself that the conversation would become concrete eventually, and when it did, I would say something about the deed. That was the plan I had been operating on since 2013, not to volunteer the information unnecessarily, but to make it known when it became relevant. I had always assumed the moment would be obvious when it arrived. The conversation became concrete on a Tuesday morning in March, when my phone lit up with 44 messages and my mother's instructions to keep the closing date away from me. The moment was, in fact, obvious. I read the messages in the order they were sent. The thread had started 3 days earlier, on a Saturday, when Greg sent the group a message that read, "Dennis confirmed. Listing goes live Wednesday. Closing target is 45 days. Everything on track." My mother had replied with a photograph of something, a paint chip, I gathered, the realtor suggesting a neutral color for the front door before listing. Dana had sent 3 replies in a row that amounted to enthusiasm. My father had sent a single thumbs up. There were logistics, a timeline for clearing out the last of Grandpa's furniture, a question about the riding lawnmower in the garage that Greg wanted to sell separately, a 3-message conversation about what to do with the boxes of old photographs in the upstairs hall closet. At no point in 44 messages did anyone type my name except my mother, and she typed it only to say to exclude me. I want to describe what I felt reading that, but the formula for this kind of feeling is difficult to express as a single thing. It was not rage. It was something closer to recognition, the particular sensation of having a long-held and quietly managed suspicion confirmed in plain text. I had spent years as the family's administrative support. I had been useful. I had been the one who showed up. And when the moment came to divide what remained of my grandfather's estate, I was the logistical problem to be routed around. My mother had used the phrase "talk it to death." I turned that phrase over in my mind for a while. It meant, I think, that she anticipated I would ask questions. She was correct that I would have asked questions. She had decided that asking questions was a form of obstruction rather than a reasonable response to being left off a transaction that required my legal consent. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. I drove home. I took the manila folder out of the glove compartment. I read the deed amendment from the first line to the last, paying particular attention to the legal description of the property, the recorded instrument number, the date of filing, and the names of the parties. Everything was exactly as it had been the afternoon Paul Osei pressed his seal to the paper in Margaret Chu's 4th-floor office. 49%. Claire L. Maddox. Instrument number recorded April 9th, 2013. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table for a while. I looked at the folder. Then I opened my laptop and found the current MLS listing for 4417 Caraway Street, which Dennis Farrow of Farrow Realty had uploaded sometime over the weekend. The asking price was $387,000. The listing described the property as a well-maintained 2-story brick home with original hardwood floors, a corner lot, and mature landscaping. The photographs were competent, taken on a bright morning, the brick warm in the winter light, the front walk clear. He had photographed the kitchen and the upstairs hallway and the backyard, where Grandpa's garden had been left dormant over the winter in long, neat rows. The listing identified the sellers as Robert and Patricia Maddox. Not Robert and Patricia Maddox and Claire Maddox. Just Robert and Patricia. I typed one line into the group chat. Actually, let's talk about the deed. Then I put the phone in my jacket pocket, left the house, and drove to work. I called Margaret Chu's office from the hospital parking lot at 8 o'clock that morning, before I went inside. Her assistant put me through after a short hold. Margaret Chu's voice was exactly as I remembered it. Unhurried, precise, the voice of someone who has kept careful records and finds the retrieving of them satisfying. I explained the situation in about 90 seconds. She asked me to hold for 4 minutes while she pulled the file. When she came back, she said, "The instrument is on record with the county. Filing date April 9th, 2013. Your ownership interest is 49%. Nothing has been amended or transferred since that date."
She paused.
"Has a title search been ordered on the property?" I told her I assumed so, given that the listing was already live. "Then the title company will find it," she said. "If they haven't already." There was a brief quiet on her end. I could hear the sound of a chair adjusting. "Claire," she said, "do you want me to reach out to the listing agent directly, or would you prefer to handle the first contact yourself?" I thought about 44 messages. I thought about talk it to death. "I'll handle the first contact," I said. "Then I'd like to formally retain you." "That's fine," she said. "Call me this afternoon." I went inside. I sat at my desk. I processed billing claims. I reconciled a remittance discrepancy that had been sitting in my queue since the previous week and that required 2 calls to a pair's provider relations line before it was resolved. I ate a granola bar at my desk at 11:15. Renee Solberg came by at noon with a question about a cardiology code. I answered it correctly. She thanked me and went back to her office. My phone in my jacket pocket had been vibrating with some regularity since approximately 8:43 in the morning. At 12:07, I stepped into the hallway outside the billing suite and looked at my screen. 14 missed calls. 3 from my mother. 4 from Greg. 2 from my father. 3 from Dana. 1 from a number I did not recognize. 1 from a number I had looked up that morning. Dennis Farrow, Farrow Realty. Dennis Farrow had also sent a text. It read, "Ms. Maddox, this is Dennis Farrow. I've just received a call from the title company regarding a recorded instrument on the Caraway Street property. Could you please call me at your earliest convenience?" I called Dennis Farrow first. He answered on the second ring. His voice carried the particular quality of a person who has encountered a complication he cannot yet fully scope and is attempting to remain professionally calm while doing so. He confirmed that Meridian Title Group had flagged a co-ownership interest during their morning title search. He said, with the careful phrasing of someone measuring each word before releasing it, that the listing agreement had been signed by his clients Robert and Patricia Maddox, and that the recorded instrument indicated a 49% ownership interest held by a Claire L. Maddox, and that he hoped we could speak directly to clarify the situation. I told him the situation was straightforward. My grandfather had executed the co-ownership amendment in 2013. The instrument was on public record with the county. I had the original documentation. I had not been contacted about the listing, the asking price, the closing timeline, or the selection of his firm. A silence followed. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. "I see," he said. "The listing cannot proceed as currently structured," I said. My voice was even. I was not performing evenness. It was simply what I had in me at that moment. "I'm not asking you to take any action today. I'm informing you that I'm aware of the situation and that I'm retaining my own attorney. You'll hear from her." He thanked me. He sounded like a man who was mentally reviewing every step of the past 3 weeks and identifying the one he would do differently. I called Margaret Chu at 12:30. She confirmed she could represent my interest. She said she would contact Farrow Realty formally that afternoon and would copy me on the correspondence. She also noted, in the plain way she had of stating legal facts, that any closing on the property required my signature as a co-owner of record, and that no title company would issue a clear title policy without resolving the co-ownership instrument. "So the listing is effectively suspended," I said. "Until the ownership question is resolved, yes," she said. "No lender will fund on a clouded title." I thanked her. I went back to my desk. I worked until 5. On the way home, I stopped for groceries, cooked dinner, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I had decided sometime during that afternoon that the way to move through the next several weeks was to continue being exactly who I already was while other people figured out who I was to them. At 2:17, lying in bed, I saw my phone light up with my mother's 5th call of the day. I watched it until the screen went dark. The 48 hours after the group chat message were notable for what did not happen as much as for what did. Greg called 8 times over 2 days before he sent a text. The text said, "Claire, we need to talk about this. There has clearly been a miscommunication, and we all want to handle it fairly. Please call me back." I read the word miscommunication. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. My mother left 2 voicemails in the same day. The first said she was hurt that I had not simply called her directly, that this was not how the family handled things, and that she hoped I was not doing anything drastic. The second, left about 90 minutes later, said she understood I might be upset, but that the house had needed to be sold, and they had not wanted to burden me with the logistics given how busy I was with work, and that they had of course fully intended to include me in the proceeds once the sale was complete, and that she loved me and hoped I would call. I played both voicemails once. I did not save them. My father sent one text. "Claire, please call your mother." Dana sent, "I'm sorry. I didn't know nobody had told you. I thought you already knew." Dana's was the only message I kept. It was the only one that did not ask me to do something, and it was the only one that did not contain a revised version of events. Margaret Chu sent 3 formal letters over the following week. One to Faro Realty, one to Meridian Title Group, and one to my parents' personal attorney, a man named Howard Briggs. Howard Briggs had handled my parents' wills and a previous property matter some years earlier. He was experienced and evidently surprised. His first letter to Margaret Chu contained a paragraph suggesting that the 2013 instrument might have been executed under conditions of diminished capacity, given Grandpa's age and medical history at the time of signing. Margaret Chu's response addressed that paragraph in 4 precise paragraphs of its own. She referenced the notary record, Grandpa's documented cognitive evaluation from his cardiologist dated 3 months before the signing, the fact that he had continued to manage his own financial and legal affairs without any legal guardianship or capacity intervention for 8 years following the execution of the document, and a line from the notary's own certification that affirmed the signatory's apparent soundness of mind at the time. She also noted that the argument, if pursued, would require producing evidence that contradicted the notary's certification, which carried its own legal weight. Howard Briggs did not raise the diminished capacity argument again in any subsequent correspondence. The formal meeting happened 12 days after the group chat. It was held at Margaret Chu's office, the same 4th-floor room with a conference table and the window over the river. Outside, the river was still carrying the pale gray of early spring, the ice gone but the color not yet returned to the water. My parents arrived with Howard Briggs. Greg had flown in from Cincinnati. He was wearing a sport coat I had not seen before, something dark with a fine pattern in it, and the expression of a man who has prepared several versions of a conversation without being certain which version will be needed. He looked tired in the way that people who travel a great deal look tired, not from the travel exactly, but from the sustained effort of being in motion. I arrived with Margaret Chu. My mother looked at me when I came through the door. Her face did not change dramatically. There was a stillness in it that I recognized, the specific stillness of someone who is recalibrating in real time, adjusting an internal account without showing the math. My father looked at the conference table. Greg looked briefly at Margaret Chu's bookcase, then at his phone, which he put face down on the table. We sat. Margaret Chu opened the meeting. She stated the legal position in plain, measured terms. The deed amendment recorded April 9, 2013, was valid, fully executed, properly notarized, and on public record with the county recorder's office. Claire L. Maddox held a 49% ownership interest in the property at 4417 Caraway Street. Any sale of the property required her written consent and her signature on all closing documents. The current listing had been suspended by Faro Realty pending resolution of the title issue. Meridian Title Group had declined to issue a preliminary title commitment until the co-ownership was addressed. She placed a copy of the recorded instrument in the center of the table. She placed a copy of the title company's suspension notice beside it. She did not embellish either document. She let them sit there. Howard Briggs studied both documents for a moment. He was a careful man, and he took his time. Then he looked up and asked whether I would be willing to sign the documents necessary to allow the sale to proceed. I said I would consider it. Greg's jaw shifted slightly. He had been leaning back in his chair, the posture of a man who expected to be done with this in 45 minutes, and now he leaned forward by about 2 inches. He started to say something and stopped. My mother said, "Claire, we're going to tell you." Margaret Chu was still. I looked at my mother. "We thought," my mother said. She pressed her hands flat on the table, both hands palm down, as if studying something beneath the surface. Greg was handling the coordination with Dennis. "We didn't want to overwhelm you. You were already carrying so much at work, and we thought—" She stopped. She looked at her hands for a moment. "We should have called you. I know that." There was a silence. The river was visible through the window behind Margaret Chu's chair, pale gray and still moving. My mother did not look at it. She looked at her hands. What she did not say, and what I did not say in that room, was the full weight of what we both understood. The 30-year operating pattern of our family. The way a family can love someone reliably and still fail to include them, Not from cruelty, but from the accumulated habit of a structure that assigned roles early and never revisited them. I was the one who handled the details. Greg was the one who managed the significant decisions. This had been true for so long that it no longer required anyone to decide it. It simply occurred, the way a river takes the same course not because it chooses to but because the channel is already there. I did not say this because Margaret Chu's conference room was not the right container for it. Some conversations cannot be had productively in rooms with attorneys present, with a recorded instrument sitting in the center of the table and two men in suits monitoring the phrasing of every sentence. I understand, I said. My mother's hands on the table did not move. Greg said, "So you'll sign." Not a question. A statement shaped like a question. He said it in the tone of someone confirming a logistical detail, something that had already been decided and simply needed verbal confirmation before the meeting could conclude and everyone could return to their respective lives. He had flown in from Cincinnati the night before. He had an afternoon flight back. He had a pin on his lapel from a professional association in commercial real estate, and he had asked me in 5 words whether I intended to sign away my legal stake in our grandfather's house, a house I had been driving to on Tuesday afternoons for 8 years while he was in Cincinnati building his career. I looked at him. I took a breath, not audibly, just the kind of breath you take when you are deciding which version of yourself to be in the next 30 seconds. "I'd like to discuss the terms," I said. The words landed quietly. That was the thing about that sentence. It was short enough that there was no way to interrupt it, and specific enough that there was no way to redirect it. It meant exactly what it said, and nothing else. Howard Briggs cleared his throat softly and reached for his legal pad. Greg's expression did not change outwardly, but something behind it did, some internal accounting reshuffling into a different column. He had come into the room with one set of assumptions about how the next hour would unfold, and those assumptions were now in the process of being revised. My father had been silent since we sat down. He looked at the table, or at his hands, or at some point slightly below the surface of either. But now, at those 5 words, "I'd like to discuss the terms," he looked up. He looked at me directly, not at the room or the situation, but at me specifically, the way you look at someone when you are seeing them as a separate person rather than as a function they perform within a shared system. His expression was one I did not have a word for in the moment. I have thought about it many times since. It was not surprise, exactly. It was something closer to the look of a man who has carried a particular understanding of a situation for a long time and has just been handed information that changes it, not dramatically, not with any outward sign, but measurably. The way a number changes when you add a variable that was previously unaccounted for. He looked at me for about 3 seconds. Then he looked back at the table. Howard Briggs asked, in his careful way, what terms I had in mind. I told him. Proportional distribution of proceeds per ownership interest. My name on the listing as a co-seller of record. Standard closing documentation. Nothing extraordinary and nothing punitive. The terms that should have been in place from the beginning. Howard Briggs wrote them down. Margaret Chu had them drafted by the end of the afternoon. What followed was 3 weeks of correspondence between Margaret Chu and Howard Briggs, 2 telephone calls I was not party to, 1 revised listing agreement, and a final settlement document that reflected what should have been the starting structure from the beginning. The terms: the property would be listed at $387,000, consistent with the original asking price. The proceeds would be distributed proportionally to each party's ownership interest, 49% to me, 51% to my parents per their existing estate documents. I would sign all required closing documents. My name would appear on the listing as a seller of record, alongside my parents. It took Howard Briggs 4 days to draft the agreement. It took me 20 minutes to read it. I called Margaret Chu with 3 questions. She answered all 3. I signed. Dennis Farrow reactivated the listing on a Thursday morning. He called me the day before, professionally and directly, to confirm the timeline. He said the photographs were still usable. I said that was fine. The front door had not been painted yet, I noted. He said he would check on that before the shoot. He did. The photographs showed the same original color, which in the listing's light looked more intentional than it was. The property received 2 offers within 9 days of relisting. The first was at asking. The The second, which came in 4 days later, was at $392,500 with a 30-day close. My parents accepted the second offer in consultation with Dennis Farrow. He called me to confirm before they accepted. I said I agreed with the decision. The closing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, 41 days out. I received a closing reminder from Meridian Title Group 8 days before the date. I also received a separate call from Dennis Farrow's office confirming the time and location. This was different from the first attempt, where I had been the person kept away from the date. I noted the difference without saying anything to anyone about it. The closing was held at Meridian Title Group's office on a Wednesday morning in late spring. The conference room was clean and businesslike, with a table large enough for all parties and a credenza along one wall that held a coffee maker no one used. The parking lot outside had been recently repaved, and the smell of it came in faintly through the ventilation. My parents arrived with Howard Briggs. Greg had flown back in. I arrived with Margaret Chu. Sandra Keel, the title officer, was a woman in her late 40s with the efficient and measured manner of someone who has overseen a great number of these transactions and has learned that the human drama surrounding them runs on its own schedule, separate from the paperwork. She handled the documentation with precision. She explained each document before she presented it, noted where each party needed to sign, and moved through the stack with the rhythm of someone who is competent and unhurried. When she reached the seller's signature page, she read the names aloud as she turned the document toward us. Robert Maddox. She indicated the line. My father signed. Patricia Maddox. She indicated the next line. My mother signed. Sandra Keel turned the page. She looked at the next line, then looked up and found me across the table. Claire Maddox. She held the page out. I took the pen from where it rested and signed my name in the space provided.
The room was quiet.
The ventilation system made a faint, continuous sound. Outside the window, the repaved parking lot was bright in the morning light. My father looked at his hands on the table. My mother looked at the window. Greg looked at his phone, face down on the table, and did not pick it up. Sandra Keel collected the signed page, aligned it with the stack, and moved to the next document without comment. She had been in this room for many closings. She understood how to hold the moment without making it larger. The proceeds were dispersed 14 business days after the closing date. My share of $392,500, 49%, as specified in the co-ownership instrument my grandfather had filed with the county in 2013, was $192,325. It arrived in the account Margaret Chu had designated in the closing documents. I received a wire confirmation on a Thursday morning while I was at my desk. I did not call anyone when it arrived. I did not send a message. I acknowledged the notification, filed the confirmation in the folder I had created for the matter, and went back to the billing claim I had been working on. At noon I had lunch with Renee Solberg in the break room. She asked me how my week was going. I said it had been a productive one. She said the same about hers. What I did not tell Renee, because it was not relevant to the conversation, was that I had spent the previous 2 weeks watching a particular kind of consequence unfold that no one in my family had designed or anticipated. Dennis Farrow had relisted the property professionally and handled the paperwork correctly from the revised starting point, but the 9-day delay between the original suspension and the relisting had pushed the timeline into a different market window. The accepted offer at $392,500 was $5,000 above asking, which was the outcome, but it was also 3 weeks later than my parents had planned. The moving company my mother had pre-booked for the furniture she wanted from the house had already filled that window and had to be rescheduled. The storage unit Greg had reserved at a facility near my parents' house cost an additional month's fee because of the delay. These were not devastating consequences. They were administrative inconveniences, the kind that accumulate when a plan is built on an assumption that turns out to be wrong. My brother Greg, I later learned from Dana, had spent a considerable amount of time on the phone with Howard Briggs during those 3 weeks, asking questions about the 2013 instrument and whether there was any viable path to challenging it. Howard Briggs had told him, evidently at some length, that there was not. The instrument was clean, the notary record was clear, and the estate attorney who drafted it had been practicing family and estate law for 30 years and had made no procedural errors. Greg had flown in for the meeting and flown back to Cincinnati and had not, to my knowledge, found a different angle. The paperwork was what it was. My mother told one of her sisters about the situation. I know this because the sister, my Aunt Donna, called me 2 weeks after the closing. She said she was sorry I had been left out of the conversation. She said she had not known. She said, carefully, that she thought my grandfather had done a thoughtful thing and that she was glad it had worked out. I thanked her. She said if I ever wanted to talk, she was there. I said I might take her up on that. I meant it. The social dimension of the thing had its own slow half-life. My family is not large, but it is interconnected enough that information moves through it in ways that are difficult to track. I became aware gradually that the story had circulated in some form, not my version exactly, but a version, the way these things circulate in families. I did not try to manage the version. I had the document. The document was the version I cared about. The weeks that followed had their own texture. My parents' house felt different when I visited, not hostile, but rearranged in some interior way. The furniture of assumption shifted. My mother made coffee when I arrived and asked about work and did not mention the closing or the deed. My father watched television in the adjoining room with a volume slightly lower than usual, as if adjusting for something he could not name. There is a particular kind of renegotiation that families do after a significant event, and it does not look like a conversation. It looks like a series of ordinary interactions in which something invisible has been slightly repositioned. I came to Sunday dinner twice in the month after the closing. The first time was quiet and careful. The second time, my mother asked me to help her find a specific document in her filing cabinet, an old warranty for a household appliance, and I found it in about 4 minutes because I knew her filing system, and she said thank you in a voice that carried more weight than the words required. I understood what was in that weight. I did not say anything about it. Some things are better left as what they are. My brother Greg called in June for months after the closing. The conversation was careful and surface level in the way that early conversations are when two people are deciding whether to go deeper or stay on the visible ground. He mentioned his work. I mentioned mine. He said, near the end, that he had not known about the deed. He said it plainly, without elaboration or qualification. I said I believed him. I do believe him. Greg is not dishonest. He simply never thought to check because he had never had reason to imagine there was anything he had missed. The operating logic of the family had always told him that he was the one who managed the significant decisions. It had not occurred to him that Grandpa might have had a different assessment of who was managing what. He never mentioned it to you? Greg asked. The deed. No, I said. Greg was quiet for a moment on his end of the line. I heard the ambient sound of wherever he was, an office, I thought, or a car. That sounds like him, he said. It did sound like him. It sounded exactly like him. Grandpa had never been the kind of man who told you what he had done on your behalf. He simply did it and trusted that the record would speak when the record needed to speak. Dana and I have dinner every few weeks now at a place near her apartment that does a very good butternut squash soup in the fall. She still apologizes occasionally for the group chat for adding me to it accidentally, for the weeks of complexity that followed. I tell her, each time, that she did me a favor. I mean it more each time I say it. She added me to that thread without thinking, and because she added me without thinking, a thing that had been quietly filed away for 11 years became the only thing that mattered on a Tuesday morning in March. I don't know what I would have done eventually without it. I would like to believe I would have spoken up when the sale became concrete. But I had been managing quietly for a very long time, and quiet becomes its own kind of inertia, and I am glad I didn't have to find out. My mother and I have had several conversations since the closing, some of them more honest than others, some of them closer to the real thing than I expected, and some of them further away. We are moving in the right direction, I think. I have stopped deciding in advance what the destination looks like. The house on Caraway Street belongs to a couple in their late 30s now, and their children. I drove past it one Saturday in July, on my way back from an errand I had completed without thinking much about the route I was taking. Someone had painted the front door. Not the neutral color Dennis Farrow had suggested for the listing photographs. A deep green, the kind of color you choose when you have already decided you are not leaving, and you want the house to know it too. It looked right against the old brick. Grandpa would have approved. He had an eye for what lasted. I drove past without stopping. I did not need to stop. Grandpa knew what he was doing in 2013 when he knocked on the passenger window and asked me to come inside. He was not trying to create a conflict or set a trap or make a point to anyone. He was doing what he had always done, watching carefully and then putting the paperwork where it reflected what he believed was actually true. He believed I would show up. He had 8 years of Tuesday afternoons as evidence. He wanted one document, recorded in one county office, to make that belief a matter of public record. I kept that laminated copy in my glove compartment for 11 years. Not because I expected anything. Not because I was building toward a specific outcome. Simply because it was something he had given me, and because he had given it to me in the same spirit as the stakes moved 3 feet east, quietly, correctly, without requiring anyone's acknowledgement. There is a version of this story where I never needed that folder, where my parents called me when the listing conversation started and said, "You're on the deed. We need to talk about this together." I would have preferred that version. I would have preferred it significantly. What I have instead is the version where it took a county recorder reading my name aloud in a conference room on a Wednesday morning to make it impossible to overlook. I am at peace with that. Not because the outcome was easy, but because the outcome was accurate. The paperwork reflected what was true. That is what paperwork is for. The work of a life is not only what you do. It is making sure your name is where it belongs. A year after the closing, I work the same billing job. I drive the same car. The glove compartment has the same manila folder in it, empty now because the document it held is filed where it belongs and the matter it governed is resolved. I keep the folder because Grandpa gave me the instinct to keep it, and because an empty folder in the right place is its own kind of reminder that you can be ready before you know what you are ready for. 8 months after the closing, I purchased a small piece of land 40 minutes outside the city, with a stand of mature oaks along the north edge that any reasonable person would agree is worth more than the structure on it. I signed the deed on a Tuesday morning. I did not bring anyone with me. The title officer at that closing, a different office, a different table, a different city, read my name aloud from the document, looked up, and handed me the pen. I signed without hesitation. I think about Grandpa on corner lots when the light is right, which happens more often than I expected, and in more places than I would have predicted. I think he would have appreciated the oaks. I think he would have said nothing about them and meant every word of it. Some things are not taken from you because someone intends harm. They are taken because no one thought to look at your name on the paperwork. And the surest answer to that I have found is not noise. It is a document, filed in the right office on the right date, with 2 signatures and a notary seal. Here is what I keep returning to, the question I cannot fully answer on my own. At the closing table, when Sandra Keel read my name aloud, my mother did not look at me. She looked at the window. I have thought about that many times since, what she was seeing there in the glass, in the light beyond it, whether it was regret or simply the reflex of someone recalibrating. I don't know, but I wonder if you do. Have you ever been in a room where someone read your name on something they had assumed was theirs and watched their face in that moment? What did you see there? If you have, I'd like to hear it in the comments below. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. A new story goes up every Thursday. I'll see you there.